Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and the question I'm asking today is Putin preparing for a fully fledged war versus an SMO? Now, let's identify what those two criteria mean. The SMO is a very different military operation in law, also in terms of what operations would be conducted on the basis of the SMO if, and I stress if, Russia was to escalate that to a war footing and officially declare war, and we have to hope that absolutely doesn't happen, then the whole conflict would become greatly magnified in terms of the intensity of the weapons deployed, the targets that could be deployed, including then what would be legitimate targets on the basis of it being a war as opposed to being an SMO. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because yesterday, for the first time since the start of the SMO, we saw Putin wearing military uniform in Kursk region. It was actually the first time he'd been seen wearing any military uniform since 2021. Now, was that a subtle hint to the Americans, or was it just a bluff? At this stage, we don't know. But then we come on to the reason why we may see this escalation. And we have to first off understand what are the reasons for this US proposal for a ceasefire between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And there are a number of factors. One is Trump and basically US politics, because Trump came out and said as part of his election promise, I'll end the war in 24 hours, which of course hasn't happened. And then 24 hours becomes 24 days, becomes 24 weeks, etc., etc. And really the United States looks politically inept, weak. And therefore they came out with this idea, I know what we can do. Let's get a ceasefire in place. Hope the ceasefire sticks after the initial 30 days, which is to say optimistic and understatement. And therefore, on that basis, look, we stopped the war. I did what I said I'd do, and all the Americans will cheerlead, say, you know, MAGA is back in force, and we can all then go away and pretend nothing's happened, and nothing is going to happen in the future. And in essence, you may argue that the United States could then be in a position to just wash its hands and say, well, we've done what we said we'd do. Now it's up to you to get to the negotiating table. And it's a way of Trump basically washing his hands of the whole Ukraine situation and putting all the onus of blame, and to a large extent, of course, it's true, on the Biden administration. The problem with this is he now risks owning this war, because if Russia says we're not interested in a ceasefire, what happens next? And we'll come on to that shortly. One of the other reasons is what's happening in Kursk. We know the Ukrainians launched an offensive into Kursk region last August in 2024. It was always doomed to fail. They have lost enormous amounts of military personnel, even more equipment. They're on the verge of being forced out of Kursk region. That would politically and geopolitically look very damaging for Ukraine. And therefore, it's a great opportunity to say, let's have a ceasefire. And then the Ukrainians can say, oh, as a goodwill gesture, we'll leave Kursk. So if we're going to leave the Russian Federation territory, you should leave the Ukrainian territory. Of course, notwithstanding the fact that the Ukrainians are about to be kicked out. So that is another motivation to have this ceasefire. The other point is, and we've mentioned this previously, is Russia now making inroads into Dnipro. That is clearly, again, geopolitically very embarrassing for the West. It's embarrassing for the Ukrainians. It's also potentially, if they do make inroads into Dnipro, then there isn't any front line there to speak of. Then very rapidly, any front line that's left will collapse, and Russia will make massive gains very rapidly. And therefore, then that would also weaken the Ukrainian position in terms of a peace agreement. And, you know, maybe arguably then Russia might say, well, we are going to have a referendum in Dnipro. And if the referendum is in favor of that region being part of the Russian Federation, then rather like Kherson and Zaporozhye and Donetsk and Lugansk, that will be what the outcome is. Now, of course, the West is going to profusely disagree with that, but we're not here to assess what side agrees with what. We know the position, it's pretty obvious, but these are the risks the West is now facing and the United States is facing. And one of the problems that Ukraine's facing, it's absolutely abundantly clear to anyone with an objective mindset that Ukraine is running out of munitions, manpower, running out of all equipment. There's just recently basically an admission that the Ukrainians have no more ATACMS left. They basically ran out of them probably around 6 weeks ago. And the irony is all they were sent was less than 40. I mean, what was the point? That's not even tokenism. It's a joke. I mean, they rapidly used them up, firing 4 or 5 at a time, which were essentially all shot out the sky by Russian air defense systems. So in essence, they are the main reasons why there is a need to be a ceasefire at this point in time. And the question, therefore, is what is the Russian response to that ceasefire going to be? Now, in very crude terms, there are 3 options. They can ignore it and say, sorry, we're not interested. They can seek a compromise saying, well, look, we've made these points before. We're not really interested in a ceasefire, but you can call it a ceasefire. But we're going to call it a long-standing permanent peace agreement. Or the other alternative is they can agree to it. I don't see them agreeing to it because that would then totally contradict everything Russia said. It would then make them look incredibly weak, and in the eyes of the Russian people, they would be particularly angry, to put it diplomatically, about that. Now, we should also factor in that, as always, Zelensky has this tendency to make very ill-advised statements, whether it's a reality or not. At this point in time, we don't know. But he said if Russia refuses to agree to a ceasefire, the US will take serious steps against Russia and strengthen Ukraine. Well, if that is indeed true, then the United States has therefore decided in its infinite wisdom that it's going to escalate the war from the position it is now. And then the Trump administration would own that war and all the consequences that were to follow. And what serious steps is the United States going to take? More sanctions, along with all the other tens of thousands of sanctions that have all failed, and strengthen Ukraine in what way? No one's got anything to give Ukraine anymore. And arguably the only thing they could give them is far heavier weapons. Well, that would be a massive escalation. And if the United States is serious about wanting to have rapprochement with the Russians in a meaningful way, well, that will just end all that in the blink of an eye. So it leaves the United States in a very difficult position, which, of course, is of their own making, because they should have stuck by their guns and said, as they did have this situation where they said to the Ukrainians, you will agree to all these following terms, then we will then consider supporting you again. But this is the framework for a peace agreement. At the moment, we have nothing but a 30-day interim ceasefire, which, frankly, is an utter waste of time, as we said previously, because it means nothing, because what happens after 30 days? They start fighting again. There is the question of who rearms on that basis. What I would say is the idea Ukraine can rearm in 30 days and be able to fight the Russians again in any meaningful way is ridiculous. And anyone suggesting it doesn't appear to have been paying any attention to what has actually been unfolding for the best part of 3 years on the battlefield. Now, with regards to ceasefires, it's worth recalling from the Russian perspective statements that Putin made back in January time, where he said, we're open to dialogue with the Trump administration with respect to the Ukraine conflict. He said the most important thing here is to eliminate the root causes of the crisis, which we have talked about many times. Absolutely. Now, from the Russian perspective, this means things like neutrality, no NATO membership, demilitarization, all the things they've said previously. Now, whether the West agrees with that or Ukraine agrees with that, isn't the point. The point is Putin in any way, shape, or form going to entertain the idea of a ceasefire? Well, we have to assess the statements the Russians have made to come to any conclusion as to whether that's a reality or not. Putin also said, as for the settlement of the situation itself, I would like to emphasize that its goal should not be a short-term ceasefire, not some kind of respite for the regrouping of forces and rearmament, the aim of subsequently continuing the conflict, but a long-term peace based on respect for the legitimate interests of all people, all nations living in this region. So that would, of course, have to also include the Ukrainians, absolutely. And he said that, of course, we will fight for the interests of Russia, the Russian people. That is, in fact, the goal and meaning of conducting a special military operation. So the position the Russians have made is unchanged. Now, can we expect some radical change on that basis? It's unlikely, but you can't say absolutely definitively it's not the case. But it's interesting that basically the Russian ambassador to the UK, Kellin, came out and said, we will stop military actions only when we have a comprehensive agreement. A temporary ceasefire is not an option for resolving the situation. Now, okay, I doubt very much he's made statements that aren't in lockstep with what the Kremlin is thinking. I think also it's worth noting there has been reports that Russia's presented the United States with a list of demands for a ceasefire. So it's a conditional ceasefire. But is that just a conditional, this is what will have to happen to start a peace agreement? And the intention is you will have to agree to these demands. So things like demilitarization, things like neutrality, things like no NATO membership. Also the issue of peacekeeping forces, they can't be NATO countries. But it's not, obviously, a fully fledged peace agreement. The details would have to be ironed out specifically in the future. Now, at this point, the West is saying there's no actual specific demands being made. Yes, Russia does want to reset relations with Washington. I don't doubt that. But in essence, the Kremlin's answers is going to be pretty much the same, if not identical, to the demands it's previously made to NATO, to the United States, and ultimately to Ukraine itself. So then the final question is, what happens next? So let's assume Russia agrees to a ceasefire, which is unconditionally, which is very unlikely. Then, okay, we carry on. It's not going to resolve anything, might kick the can down the road for a few weeks, but then the chances are this ceasefire will be breached, and Ukraine will accuse the Russia of committing acts of atrocities. You can see exactly what's going to happen. So the other alternative is, as we said, Russia just sits there and says, we don't agree with this, so we carry on regardless, which is unlikely because Russia will take the third option, which is, yes, we might agree to this with provisos to be put in place, which is the things they know full well the West is extremely unlikely to agree to. So particularly the European NATO countries. So then the question is, what happens if we reach this impasse and Zelensky's correct in his assertions, which he may or may not be, he may be just bluffing the Russians? Well, that would have to involve some sort of US escalation, because they're basically run out of all sort of what you might term lower grade military weapons. Like, they haven't got anything left to give them. So what are they going to give them? It would have to be an escalation. For me, I think it's pretty obvious Trump has no real idea what's going on the ground. And therefore, if there is an escalation, the Russians may then decide to say, well, on that basis, we're going to change the conflict from an SMO to a fully fledged war. Hence, maybe perhaps the unsubtle wearing of military uniform by Putin in Kursk. Frankly, the West shouldn't dismiss this idea. They should accept this as a possibility, as upsetting and annoying and every other adjective you want to apply to it, that may be. but they have to accept that that could be the reality of what will subsequently unfold on the ground. We have to absolutely hope at all costs that doesn't happen, because ultimately that is going to be hugely detrimental to the Ukrainians, to the Ukrainian people, to its nation. And, if Russia makes that decision to do it, that's on their head, what happens to Russian. But this is going to only end even worse for the Ukrainians than it is now. And the West needs to accept the following. They can't react quickly to anything. Ukraine has limited air defense. It has next to no equipment, munitions, etc. It clearly has serious manpower issues. It's now having to plug gaps where there's problems in Pokrovsk and with respect to Russian forces entering Dnipro. So they're pulling brigades out of Kursk. They're just basically plugging the dam. Where there's a hole, they have to go and find some forces somewhere else. They're not in any position to continue to fight this conflict. I think the argument might be for Russia to change it to a fully fledged war. Something pretty outrageous would have to happen. I think under the circumstances that's unlikely, because then it would be such an escalation that Trump would then be embroiled in a war that he wants to walk away from. He doesn't want anything to do with it. So you have to hope the logical conclusion is the Russians will come back, make some provisos, they'll reach some kind of compromise perhaps, and then there might be a ceasefire in inverted commas, but I think the Russians will loathe to implement that. But we have to hope there's a way forward, because the alternative of a major escalation because of an intransigent standpoint from the Russians or the Ukrainians is just something that has to be avoided, as I've said, at all costs. And everybody who is sound of mind would have to agree to that, because ultimately it would be devastating for Ukraine. And this is something people in the West often don't appreciate, that Russia has not fought the war with all its arsenal of weapons by having an SMO. And if it changes to a fully fledged war, then we will see devastating firepower we absolutely don't want to see in any way, shape, or form, because ultimately the Ukrainians are the people who are going to suffer hugely as a result of this. And frankly, they've suffered enough as it is. There needs to be an end to this war, and there needs to be a recognition in the West that politicians are not there to fight a war to preserve their own careers, but they should be there to realize the war is over, and it's in the best interest of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people to find a resolution, bring this conflict to a close, and ensure there is never another day's war in Ukraine ever again. And with that, we end this podcast. Thank you very much for listening, for all your support, which is greatly appreciated. Please like, share, subscribe, spread the word. We want to grow the channel because we inform people, we don't entertain people. We want to provoke thought and debate, because that is what we should be doing, not implanting sensationalistic ideas in people's mind as to something that more often than not isn't a reality. And with that, I'll say goodbye.